Greetings, welcome to our Bible study on the Acts of the Apostles, also called the Book of Acts. We are in episode 28. I am Pastor Diana Thompson. I'm the called pastor at the Canton City Lutheran Parish and the administrative pastor at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Alliance, Ohio. It is my joy, as usual, to be here with you, and I'm so excited that you're joining me today. If you've come across this video randomly, you're welcome to watch this session and then go back to my YouTube and watch other sessions, or you can go straight to the YouTube channel and start from the beginning. Whatever works for you is fine by me. I encourage you to have a Bible, translation of your choice, digital, printed, whatever you can get access to. And then I encourage you to have paper and then a pen or pencil so that you can write down your thoughts, ideas, inspirations, poetry, doodles, artwork, whatever comes to mind for you as we're going through this study time together. In our episode today, we are concluding chapter 19 and beginning chapter 20. So we're in Ephesus with Paul, and a riot occurs in Ephesus, and we'll find out the reasons why. And then Paul travels to Macedonia and Greece. So we are in chapter 19, starting at verse 21 and going through chapter 20, verse 6. So that is our expansion for today. In the book of Acts and in Luke's gospel, there are 6 themes that run in and out of all of the stories here. So we're going to look at those 6 themes now, and then we'll come back at the end of our study today and see where Luke has touched on those themes, or which of those themes he's lifted up in today's stories. So first, God's redemptive purposes. Second, salvation for all alike. Third, the blessings of poverty and the dangers of wealth. Fourth, table fellowship. Fifth, the role of a disciple. And sixth, the importance of an accurate witness. So again, those are his themes that he has running in and out of these 2 books. So I'm going to put the map up. I don't know about you, sometimes these visual pieces help, so let me know if those sorts of things are helpful to you. But we are starting today in Ephesus, and then we are going to follow the red line as it heads east through Asia, then south into Macedonia, and further south into Greece. And then we actually start coming back north, and we conclude our story today in Troas, Troas. So this is Paul's 3rd missionary journey. He is visiting some of the places that he had stopped at in his 1st and 2nd journeys, kind of just to re-emphasize the ministry there, to support his leaders there. So this is his trip to go visit all of them. Again, going back into Greece ultimately, with a goal to go back to Jerusalem for a pilgrimage. So this is kind of the movement of today's stories. So we are in chapter 19. We're starting at verse 21 through 41. So just to remember, Paul has been in Ephesus for 3 months. He's been teaching in the synagogue for the Jews who were not ready to follow Jesus. There was a lot of false truths told about the disciples and Paul, and those who are following Jesus. So Paul has taken those followers of Jesus, the people of the way, that's what they called themselves, out of the synagogue, are now meeting in a lecture hall in Ephesus. And we also then saw some of the some of the miracles that Paul was doing, and some magicians who were trying to mimic Paul's work using the phrase, how did they put it? The Jesus whom Paul proclaims. So they're not really calling on Jesus's name. They're using Paul as a conduit. And so we find they don't go to a very good end. But the believers that were part of the community but were still struggling with the difference between miracles and magic and faith and magicians and spells and things like that, had this amazing conversion moment. So this is where we pick up today. So we're still in Ephesus. Some amazing work has been going on. Paul has been there for a while. This Christian community is growing. People are growing deeper in faith, letting go of some of their pagan traditions and rituals. And this is how we end up with our story for today. So let me read these verses again. It's 20 verses. So we'll read through them and then we'll come back and break them apart a little bit. Now, after all these things had been accomplished, Paul resolved in the Spirit to go through Macedonia and Achaia, and then to go on to Jerusalem. He said, "After I have gone there, I must see Rome." So again, Paul is planning to visit some of the churches he's already been in, going to Jerusalem for a pilgrimage, and then already knowing that he's going to travel to Rome. So he sent 2 of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, to Macedonia, while he himself stayed for some time longer in Asia. About that time, no little disturbance broke out concerning the way. A man named Demetrius, a silversmith who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought no little business to the artisans. These he gathered together with the workers of the same trade and said to them, "Men, you know that we get our wealth from this business. You also see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost the whole of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and drawn away a considerable number of people, saying that gods made with hands are not gods. And there is danger not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but also the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be scorned, and she will be deprived of her majesty that brought all Asia and the world to worship her." When they heard this, they were enraged and shouted, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." The city was filled with the confusion, and people rushed together to the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians who were Paul's travel companions. Paul wished to go into the crowd, but the disciples would not let him. Even some of the officials of the province of Asia, who were friendly to him, sent him a message urging him not to venture into the theater. Meanwhile, some were shouting one thing, some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. Some of the crowd gave instructions to Alexander, whom the Jews had pushed forward. And Alexander motioned for silence and tried to make a defense before the people. But when they recognized that he was a Jew, for about 2 hours of all of them shouting in unison, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." But when the town clerk had quieted the crowd, he said, "Citizens of Ephesus, who is there that does not know the city of Ephesus is the temple keeper of the great Artemis and of the statue that fell from heaven? Since these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rash. You have brought these men here who are neither temple robbers nor blasphemers of our goddess. If therefore Demetrius and the artisans with him have a complaint against anyone, the courts are open, and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges there against one another. If there is anything further you want to know, it must be settled in the regular assembly. For we are in danger of being charged with rioting today, since there is no cause that we can give to justify this commotion." When he had said this, he dismissed the assembly. So, like I said, this is a big, a long 20 verses, and there's a lot going on here. So let's break some things down. So first, looking at verses 21 through 22, these are actually it's a transitional kind of paragraph, transitional 2 verses of transition. And they actually are foreshadowing what's going to be happening in the rest of Acts, and help kind of form the movement forward for the narrative. So it implies that the maturity of the Ephesians community is coming to its fullness, and that Paul is being sent by the Holy Spirit to visit the previous communities that have been established, but also now there's this call for him to go to Rome. So after his journey to Jerusalem, he's planning his trip to Rome. And remember, Rome is the center of the empire. This is the political place where all laws come out of. This is the political place where all appointees come out of. So this is really an important political location. But we still have a ways to go before we actually get to Rome. So let's keep moving forward. So just remember that this is kind of a reminder to us of what's going to happen, or a preparing for us of what's going to happen for Paul in the future of this story. So one of the things we want to note is that God is still cooperating with, Paul is still cooperating with God. So his missions, his trips are all divinely inspired. They are set, he is given this information from God. But he also, again, in these verses, sends two of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, to Macedonia, while he stays a little longer in Asia. But again, not uncommon for him to send some delegates, some representatives ahead of him, to let them know he's coming, to maybe kind of get a sense of what's going on there. So maybe when Paul comes, he can get a report. We don't know exactly why he does that, but it's pretty general. It's pretty much a part of his practice. And of course, he always sends them in twos, just like Jesus sent the disciples when he sent them out to do healing and sharing the good news. He sent them in twos. And I think there's something powerful about that reality, and that it continues to be practiced within this early church setting. So then the heart of the story is then in verses 23 through 41. And again, this is a reminder that Paul has this amazing authority through the Holy Spirit. And now the conflict, just like it was when he healed the spirit out of the seer's the servant that was seeing the future, the charge is that he is undermining the economy. He's messing with people's ability to earn money. And this is the heart of what's happening in this conflict, but it's happening in a bigger scale. So this is very important. So a little bit of history about Artemis and the religious reality of that time. So Artemis was a Greek goddess. Her Roman equivalent is Diana. Great name, gotta love that. Sorry, personal moment there. So this cult of Artemis, this religion to worship Artemis, is actually well documented in ancient literature, and it's been enforced and made really well aware in archaeological expeditions. So the Temple of Artemis is found in Ephesus, and it's actually considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And it was also a financial center for all of the Roman Asia area. So very important why disrupting the financial status and economic function would have been vitally important. So because this temple to Artemis was here, the support of the temple did things like provide relief to the poor and shelter for refugees. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? But the stature of Artemis in the pagan pantheon was actually due in large part to the amazing splendor of the temple that was built in her name. And then, of course, there were all sorts of practices and celebrations that were done in this temple. So again, it was the Roman equivalent in Asia of what Jerusalem would have been to Jews and Muslims today, or even back then, where there was a place where they would go and have these great celebrations. So as I mentioned, Artemis is the Greek name. The equivalent is Diana in the Roman religion. But Artemis was Apollo's sister. She was a virgin goddess, a defender of chastity, the goddess of the hunt, and the champion of fertility. So in the local religion, there were other things that were associated with her. But this reality is that this center, this temple, was not only a place of worship, but around it was a whole economic support system. And Demetrius was part of the Silversmiths Guild. And part of what they would do is they would create small statuaries of Artemis for pilgrims to come and purchase to take home with them. There was all sorts of other things that would be coming out of pilgrims being there, people coming for the celebrations. So Paul's pulling away pagan worshipers to the way of Christ not only was affecting the Jewish church, the Jewish synagogue, the Jewish community there, it was now affecting the economic stability of the community. And the way Demetrius describes it is that, his influence isn't just in Ephesus, but like other people outside of Asia aren't coming and doing their dedications and their gifts to the temple of Artemis because they're hearing about this way, this other religion. And it's really a big challenge. It's subverting a way of life. And these people who are depending on that way of life are now finding themselves in a significant bind. So in verses 25 through 27, Demetrius organizes a protest movement among, again, his guild of silversmiths. And they say, this is a person who's threatening our way of life. This movement, this person, this reality is not helpful to us. And then, of course, he expresses his great anxiety in the second half of verse 25 is that, we get our wealth from this business. And the word euphoria, which is the word used for wealth here, is different than mammon, which is like money, financial wealth. This word for wealth is more holistic. So it's not just financial gain, but also a sense of well-being. So they're finding financial instability, but they're also finding instability kind of, again, in their way of life as a whole, in their well-being. So using kind of this idea, this word that Demetrius raises up is that even though he says it's about their whole well-being, the more he talks, the more it comes clear that it's not because of his religious dedication. He's not finding his religious identity undermined. Ultimately, it still comes back down to a materialistic one. His reality as a goldsmith who sells these statuary is under fire because the culture is shifting and what he's offering is no longer as desirable as it once was. And so, of course, Demetrius appeals to his colleagues in the Silver Guild and, has charged Paul with persuading people and drawing people away from the worshiping Artemis. So in verse 26, first part, clearly it's just reminding us that, Paul's ministry is actually very effective. It's been so successful that it's now starting to actually change the financial culture of the community. And that's a pretty big change. That's pretty substantial. And then in his final statement, Demetrius brings together a series of things to kind of prove his claim. So he talks about all Asia and the world, and then of course says he's not only threatening our trade, but also the temple itself, that he's threatening the goddess and the ability of the goddess and the cult, the worship of Artemis. I shouldn't say cult, because in our world that has a negative connotation. Worshippers of Artemis. So there's this sense of this is also having like global impact, not only in his income and his importance in the religion, but in the religion itself. So in verses 28 through 31, we see that Demetrius' speech has the intended effect. His audience becomes enraged and cry out, in unison, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," in verse 28. So again, praising this goddess that they are followers of. And their acclamation is a form of confession that well expresses both their devotion to her and their astonishment that the great Artemis cult could be under attack. So to give some local color to this descriptive event, Paul talks about a theater in Ephesus which accommodated 24,000 people. So, I mean, this is big, and it was meant often for large public assemblies. Now, it's unclear why this crowd would drag Gaius and Aristarchus, who were the Macedonians who were traveling with Paul, unless it's just to remind us as readers that this potential riot, this conflict and craziness at Ephesus was a threat to Paul's plans to travel, and for Gaius and Aristarchus to get to Rome. So again, maybe that's part of what's going on here. But then, of course, Paul, being the leader that he is, he wants to go into the crowd. He wants to let his disciples see him, to know what is going on. But his disciples actually hold him back. They say, "Don't do this." They would not. They refuse to let him get into the crowd. And even officials who were friendly to him were saying, "Don't come. It's not helpful. It's not a good idea. It's not safe." So that's a really interesting reality that is going on here. So again, in verses 32 through 34, Luke reminds us that there is complete chaos going on. And even while they're in this assembly hall, there's still so much confusion. People are shouting, and some people are saying some things, and some people are saying another. And it really kind of is that, okay, what's really happening here? And if you know when a crowd gets worked up, sometimes what the initial cause is isn't what's being played out over the end. So we might be having just like, okay, people are riled up, and now we have a mob. Now we have a mob scene. It's not a good thing. Rome has a strict issue with people who start riots. They refuse to allow them to happen. People who are instigators of riots are crucified. This was actually one of the reasons why the temple leaders really wanted Pilate to order Jesus' crucifixion and not themselves. They did not want to have a riot. A riot is destructive. People who would be placed in charge of cities and regions where there was a riot would lose their position, and often they would also be killed because they couldn't keep control over their people. So riots were bad, very, very bad. This public way of protesting would have been completely unacceptable. So the fact that there was this huge group of people all riled up were probably causing great anxiety among the civic leaders of that area, even if they didn't quite understand why there was this dust up. But ultimately it comes to understand, that there are people, there's a reason why they're upset. But it's really interesting that we have kind of this insert in it with those verses 33 and 34. Some of the crowd gave instructions to Alexander, whom the Jews had pushed forward. So maybe, we don't know exactly, there's no background of who Alexander was. But clearly the Jews were asking him to step forward. And maybe, the commentators are saying probably trying to differentiate what they would consider the faithful Jew to the followers of the way. But in that day and time, there was huge anti-Semitism. And so trying to distance the Jews of the synagogue from the part of the way would not have been even part of the reality of those who might have been in that crowd. They're like, you're all Jews. Paul acts like a Jew. I don't understand. Like, you can't differentiate. You're all Jews. So even though Alexander was asked to step forward, he wasn't heard. There was no interest in listening to him. He was a Jew, whether they thought he was part of the way or whether they just was like, we don't want to hear your side of anything. Like, you just need to be quiet. And ultimately what happens then is the town clerk was able to stand up, and he was a town official. He was able to stand up and make a speech calling these folks who had started this riot, who had made these charges, to question and say, wait a second, what you're doing and what you're saying are incorrect. If Paul needs to be on trial because he broke some civil law, then you need to go through the appropriate channels. There are plenty of opportunities for you to do this. You don't get to riot over this. That's why they have the legal system. He says, first of all, your religious claims don't hold true. He's not a temple robber, nor is he blaspheming the goddess. So your religious issues are not the case. And then he says, if you truly have a complaint, you go to the courts, the proconsuls will hear it, bring those charges there. This is not how we're going to deal with this. This is not how we're going to work. And so this is what is happening. Now, of course, they didn't have their hands on Paul. Gaius and Aristarchus were the ones who were kind of standing in for Paul in the middle of this. So this town clerk really was the one who called into action, made accountable those who are creating the commotion. And finally, he says, okay, there's a religious issue and there's a legal issue. The religious issue is you think they're undermining the temple, but he's like, they haven't done anything. They haven't robbed the temple, and they haven't been blasphemous against the goddess. So your religious charges don't stand, and your civic charges don't get dealt with here. This is not how we do it. And so he really stood up against the mob. Now, he wasn't standing up for Paul or his assistants that were in the mob, but he was just basically saying, you're not being practical. And this is really interesting because again and again, whenever Paul or the followers of Christ are brought against charges, the charges are always found to be false, or it's the wrong charge for the wrong place. So, making false legal charges, or, attempting to have Paul stoned instead of doing what was supposed to be done, having Paul arrested and thrown into jail. Paul and Barnabas get thrown into jail without their legal rights being honored. And it comes back it comes back on them because they aren't doing what is right. They're so concerned about what they're losing, whatever that is, whether it's a religious status, in this particular case, their economic, their income, their ability to make money on the way they had. None of that holds up because they then go about it in a wrong way. So the clerk makes 3 legal statements and tells the community not to be rash. So first, as I mentioned, they're not temple robbers or blasphemers. So they've done nothing against the Artemist religious community that would constitute legal evidence against them. Second, the mob has acted inappropriately by dragging Gaius and Aristarchus, and of course Paul, to the theater. There's legal protocols to handle those sort of complaints, which of course he then says. And then finally, the town clerk moves to defer whatever accusations might have been brought against Paul to the regular assembly. And that obviously this one was not. This was an impromptu case. It was rioting, and it is a challenge. Now you can see these clerks' arguments kind of as a parable to the scribe Gamaliel in chapter 5, verses 35 through 39, though in a very different setting. This is not the court, this is not the Sanhedrin court, but this was in the midst of a riot. But he appeals for nothing rash to be done. And he actually uses a very similar argument that Gamaliel uses in regards to, if this is of God, then it will flourish. If it is not of God, it will die of its own, die on its own. Here, this clerk says that since the Artemis shrine fell from heaven, and Ephesus is the temple keeper, the gods must be for us, and Paul can do nothing that subverts true believers from the Artemis shrine. So he's saying you can't charge him with stealing people who clearly weren't faithful enough to stay. So ultimately, he's even undermines their religious claims of what Paul is doing, that he is kind of stealing people from the temple worship of Artemis and that religious practice. So it's very interesting that, again, in this case, it's a non-Christian. There's nothing in here that says that this council person was either pro-Paul nor part of the Christian community. He's just saying, let's stop this foolishness. And it might have been part self-protection because, again, riots were put down, and they were put down hard, and those who were in charge don't want to be held accountable for that. So they're going to short-circuit that as quickly as possible. So once he had said that and basically said, what you're doing is wrong and why you're doing it is wrong, you need to go home. And he dismissed the assembly, and it appears that everything settled, and it's just a strange reality. So then we come into this very next section, which really does tell us that the uproar had ceased. And this is chapter 20, verses 1 through 6. And these 6 verses actually feel really anticlimactic compared to the actions and the speeches that we saw throughout chapter 19. The healings, the conversions, this riot, this attempt to not only undermine Paul, but really to destroy the Christian community. So what we have in verses 1 through 6 is actually quite a quick travel narrative and the introduction to a new set of folks that will be working with Paul. So let me read those verses for you, and then we'll look at them more closely. So this is chapter 20, verses 1 through 6. After the uproar had ceased, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them and saying farewell, he left for Macedonia. When he had gone through those regions and had given the believers much encouragement, he came to Greece, where he stayed for 3 months. He was about to set sail for Syria when a plot was made against him by the Jews, so he decided to return through Macedonia. He was accompanied by Sopater, son of Pyrrhus of Berea, by Aristarchus and Secundus from Thessalonica, and by Gaius from Derbe, and by Timothy, as well as by Tychus and Trophimus from Asia. They went ahead and were waiting for us in Troas, but we sailed from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days we joined them in Troas, where we stayed for 7 days. So as I said, this seems like a really interesting but quick travel narrative, and I'm going to put the map up just so you can kind of see quickly where we were. So remember, we were leaving Ephesus, and he was heading for Greek, but he traveled by land through there, and as you can see, he ended up back in Corinth. And then he was planning to set sail for Syria, which commentators believe would have put him into Jerusalem probably in time to celebrate the Passover, which would have been his goal. But yet he realized that there was a charge made against him. So to throw his enemies off his track, he ended up going back by land. And you can see that as the red line with the arrow going north again. And we find him traveling back around to Troas. To Philippi, and then ultimately in Philippi he celebrates unleavened bread and then ends up in Troas. So I'm going to turn that map off again. So just a few reminders. It's very interesting as we look at this, because of course in the early part he's going back through. It doesn't give us every stop he took, but he's going back through and he's going to encourage the believers. So he's returning to some of these places where he's been before. But when he gets into Greece, he stays for 3 months, which again, okay, 3 months, but we get nothing about what is happening in those moments. But again, it's probably, again, continuing to encourage the believers. So we have a list of 7 traveling companions, but we get no description of their responsibilities, just kind of where they're from. And of course, then they're sent kind of as the advance team to Troas, which again is back in Asia. And again, making preparations for Paul's visit there. And then we have, again, this quick kind of movement through. So following the detour through Macedonia, Paul is delayed in Philippi. And he is in Philippi where he celebrates the days of unleavened bread, which is the Passover. So you can see that referenced in Luke chapter 22. And then he ultimately joins in Troas. But it's interesting that he ends up in Philippi for the Passover, because that is one of the places where there was such a huge pagan influence. And one of the concerns of the Jerusalem church was that, the Jewish tradition would be undermined by this Gentile contingent within the community. And the Jerusalem Christian church, should say. So the fact that he actually is in Philippi for the Passover actually starts to anchor the reality that this is a faithful community, that this is a community that still honors the act and work of Passover. But it also kind of sets a timeline for this traveling. So if Paul had been in Corinth and planning to sail, he would have had about 7 weeks. If Paul was in Philippi and wanted to be in Jerusalem in time for Pentecost, then he would have about 7 weeks to get from Philippi to Jerusalem, and that's where he will be working his way back to. But we also recognize that this reference helps portray, to show Luke's portrayal of Paul as a faithful and religious Jew who is integrating his ancestral practices with the belief of Jesus being the Messiah, a living God. So Philippi, a place where we recognized, was full of anti-Semitism, that didn't have an urban synagogue. Remember, they were gathering outside the walls, and even remembering that Paul was left that town under police escort. That Paul's impact in Philippi was such that there's now a worshiping community within the city limits of God-fearing Gentiles. And you see that in chapter 16, verses 35 through 40. And they are not being polluted by Gentile reality. This is a faithful, living community. So Paul, the pious Jew, is in Philippi celebrating the Passover with a congregation of God-fearing Gentile believers. So even though that wasn't Paul's intention, his intention was to sail closer to Jerusalem and be in Jerusalem for the Passover. He ends up making a statement, whether he knew it or not, that the Passover is something that is a gift for all people. For us, it is ultimately is the celebration of the Lord's Supper. We don't, as a Christian, celebrate the Passover as the eating and, the meal that our Jewish brothers and sisters do. But it is the anchor and center of what has become our Eucharistic meal or Holy Communion. So again, important reality that Paul continues to live faithfully, even when he lands in places where others would say, no faithful person lives, no faithful Jew lives. So that is where we are and where we're going to conclude today's episode. So let's look quickly at the themes that Luke has lifted up over the course of his book and see which one of them are touched on in our stories today. So first, God's redemptive purposes. Not directly. I mean, there's the implication that lots of people came into faith. There's an implication that Philippi has a thriving group of Christians, followers of the way. Second, salvation for all alike. Again, the community in Ephesus was a mix of Jews and Gentiles. The community in Philippi was almost all Gentile. There really wasn't a welcoming opportunity for Jews in Philippi. They were not welcomed in general. So that community was definitely one that says it was available. It's a salvation for all people. 3, the blessings of poverty and the dangers of wealth was not part of our topics today. 4th, table fellowship. This is touched on that Paul is celebrating the Passover with the Christians in Philippi. So this table fellowship, this gathering, this meal of celebration is definitely one of the characteristics here. How about 5th, the role of a disciple? So the role of disciple is to faithfully preach the word, to faithfully share the message. So Paul, revisiting the communities that have been established, is a way to affirm that as well. We see that, the Philippi church is still there. The Corinthian church is still there. These communities still exist. And then 6th, the importance of an accurate witness. So again, Luke really wants people to understand he wants it to be set in the reality of the time. This is not a work of fiction for Luke. This is the telling of a true story. So for him, talking about the Temple of Artemis, talking about how people behaved and some of the organizational pieces is definitely a reality there. Paul, again, practicing the faithfulness, wanting to be in Jerusalem for the Passover, but when he wasn't, he was still faithfully having his Passover meal. So very important for Luke to have that as that faithful witness, accurate witness of what it meant to be the early church. So that is where we're concluding today. Thank you so much for joining me. If you have any questions or comments or reflections, feel free to post them on the YouTube channel. In just a moment, you'll see my social media contacts as well as my email. You're welcome to message me there as well. And I want to thank you so much for joining me. And our next episode, episode 29, we will conclude chapter 20. And we will have Paul's farewell visit to Troas, and then the voyage from Troas to Miltius, and then Paul speaks to the Ephesian elders. So this is chapter 20, starting at verse 7 through verse 38. Grace and peace to you, my dear Theophilus. God is with you.